What is the ultimate source for all energy, Cece? Yeah, the sun. The sun is the source of energy for all living things. And all living things, we know, need energy. When we talked about the needs and characteristics of life, we said all living things must obtain, guys, obtain and use energy. Jimmy. So the sun is the source of that for ecosystems. But there's only a limited class of organisms that can actually use the sun's energy directly. What is it? No.
Plants.
Plants, and there's some other things.
Bacteria.
Some types of bacteria. Yes, we call those things producers. They're able to take in the sun's energy and use it, transform it into what? Glucose. Let's just review. So, what do we call that process? All right, raise your hand if you can tell me what is one of the raw materials of photosynthesis. Ryan?
O2.
No?
Oh.
Linda? Matt? Light?
Yeah.
Okay. Water? Peter? And carbon dioxide. So if we have those three things, what can they be transformed into? Glucose and, Kayla? Oxygen. So light, carbon dioxide, and water produce glucose and oxygen. This happens in what organelle in a plant cell?
Chloroplast.
Chloroplast. All right. So producers are able to harness the sun's energy, transform it into glucose, which they use as their food source. And what's another term we have for producers? Right? Yeah, also called autotrophs, meaning self-feeding. So producers can use the sun's energy to transform into a usable energy. What about consumers then? How does everything else get its energy? Yeah? Well, yeah, but that's sort of, they need a way to get the original glucose up. Yeah, they eat, well, not only other consumers, they can get energy by eating producers as well. So they eat other organisms. So everything that is not a producer has to eat something else to get its energy. What's the word for these organisms? Another term for a consumer. Brandon? Heterotrophs.
How do the sun get its name?
I don't know. So in an ecosystem, we have producers and consumers. And then we also have another category of organism called decomposers. And decomposers are organisms that break down dead material, waste products. If you went onto the road and found a squirrel that just got killed in the road and put it in your backyard and took a picture of it each day for a few weeks, what would you see in those series of pictures?
Oh, yes, the last one.
Yeah, what's happening to it? Right? Yeah, it's being broken down by what we call decomposers. Generally, these are fungi and bacteria will break it down. They actually use that material as their energy source and then return those nutrients back into the ecosystem so that other species can then use those nutrients. So they're sort of like the recyclers of the ecosystem, breaking down dead material and waste and returning those nutrients back to the ecosystem. If it weren't for decomposers, we'd be up to our necks in dead animals and plants. Luckily, they are there.
Mr. Arnold, he used to be like he used to take like scraps from like plastic bags, and he used to have that as decomposers.
Yeah, like composting?
Yeah.
Yep. All right, so when we talk about how energy moves through an ecosystem, we use food chains to show that. A food chain basically shows how energy is moving through the ecosystem. It must always start with what?
Sun.
Well, often we don't include the sun because it's not an organism. So then what would we use after the sun?
Producer.
Yeah, we always start with the producers. And a food chain shows predator-prey relationships. What's eating what? The one thing that sometimes confuses people is which direction the arrows go in. Arrows always go from what was eaten to what ate it. Think about it. If you eat a carrot, the arrow would point from the carrot to you. Think about it, what's going into what's mouth. You're putting the carrot in your mouth, that's why the arrow points towards you. What about sharks? Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes there are multiple food sources, and that's okay. And we'll talk about a food web, which includes that. So if I have a simple food web here, I have a producer, wheat, which might be eaten by a mouse, which is eaten by a snake, which is eaten by an eagle. That's a food chain. Pretty simple. A food chain is just one thing eats another, eats another, eats another. What would we call the wheat? Producer. What would we call everything else?
Consumers.
Yeah, consumers. Now sometimes we take it a step further and we identify the consumers as to what their trophic level is, where on the food chain they are. The first organisms that eat the producers are called first level consumers. Then the snake would be called what? Second level and third level, yes. What's another word for a first level consumer?
First level.
No? First level consumers?
First class predators.
No? Also called herbivores. They're the things that eat the producers. All right, so here again I have is this a food chain or a food web?
Web. Both.
No.
Neither.
One. It's one of them.
The web. Chain.
It's a chain. It's one thing goes to another to another. There are no interconnections.
What?
There's no interconnections, and that's what a food web is. Things with multiple food sources.
Some fishy people.
So,
Actually.
if we define some terms, I think you know all these words, right? Raise your hand if you can tell me what is an herbivore. Raise your hand. Matt?
Eats only plants.
That eats only plants, a plant eater. How about a carnivore? What is a carnivore, Chloe?
Eats meat.
Something that eats meat, eats other animals. Predator and prey? What is a predator? Habib?
What is the prey?
Yeah, it's basically the hunter. And the prey is?
Hunted.
The hunted. What is an omnivore, Brandon?
They eat whatever they want to.
Well, yeah, it's something that eats both plant and meat.
Where did it eat you?
They eat rock. Where would a space bear be on the
A space.
How about a heterotroph? What's a heterotroph, Julia?
An organism that like hunts for food?
Yeah, something that has to go out and hunt for food, find other things to eat. Cannot make its own food. as opposed to an autotroph, which
Make its own.
makes its own food. What's the process called?
Photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis. Now, leading up to our next topic is energy pyramids. So, if you imagine this ecosystem that's shown here, a pond, a lake, I guess. So you have here algae, which are producers. Then you have some tiny little organisms that eat eat the producers. Then you have some insects that eat those. Then you have a perch that eats the insects, and then a pike that eats the perch. If you were to imagine this ecosystem, which of those species would you expect there to be the most of, the most abundant in that lake?
Smallest.
Kimberly? Well, in this case, yes, but not always, but you're on the right track. No, they? The producers. If you think about the algae, there's millions and millions of them. If you were to collect up all the algae, it would be the most abundant organism in that ecosystem. What would you expect there to be the least of?
The biggest.
Nicholas?
Highest predator.
Yeah, the highest predator. In this case, it's the pike. And that's always...
Would that be the man?
No, we're not including the man in that because
Third level.
they can eat at various levels depending on. So, yes, in that ecosystem, there's the most algae and the least of the top predator. That's always the case. We talk about that by drawing an energy pyramid. But before we get to that, we need to just mention a food web. So how is a food web different than just, raise your hand, than just the food chain we're talking about? Linda? Everything's interconnected. That different species have multiple food sources when we draw it as a food web. And it's more realistic because in an ecosystem, most species can eat multiple foods. They don't just have one specific food source. And you could think of a food web as many interconnected food chains. Now, if I look at this, one food chain would be the plant to the shrimp to the fish to the crane. Another one would be the plant to the crayfish to the crane. Those are two different food chains that are contained within this food web. And that brings us to our last topic, this energy pyramid. Like as we were just telling you, in that ecosystem, we expect the most algae and the least pike. And so we can illustrate that using an energy pyramid. It shows how much of each type of organism there are in that ecosystem. Okay? And it gets smaller as we go up to the top. And at the base of the energy pyramid is always what? Always the producers. In any ecosystem, the most abundant species is always the producers. But why? So why are there fewer herbivores than there is producers? Nicholas?
If there were too many herbivores, they would eat all of the producers, and then there would be no food if they don't die.
Yeah, and that other is because energy is lost. When one organism consumes another, energy is lost in the process. If you eat let's say you eat an ear of corn. That corn has a certain amount of calories in it, maybe 100 calories or 200 calories. Does your body use all of that energy for you to grow bigger? No. Most of that energy is what happens to it. Yeah, it's used for all your various activities, your life activities, to keep you moving, to power your muscles, to keep your body temperature high. Most energy gets used up. Only about 10% of energy is available to make you grow larger. Okay? And so as that continues, each step up the food chain, we get less and less energy available, and therefore can support fewer and fewer organisms. Only about 10% of energy gets to the next level. 90% is used up. And we have a few diagrams here to show this. Again, this ecosystem, this is like the one we just saw, where we get less and less energy. This one actually gives you some numbers. Think about the sun shining on the water in the ocean, it's about 500,000 units of energy. The plants can only absorb and use about 10,000. When those plants are eaten by tiny herbivores, they can only use about 1,000. And then the fish eating them only get about 100, and the fish eating those only get about 10. We're dropping by 90% each time, only 10% makes it to the next level. Here's another example. If we have this is probably from some kind of forest or field ecosystem. You have producers, the plants, then you have some grasshoppers, some mice, and then the snake. And that should make sense with what you know. If you think about a forest, you go hiking in the woods. What's the most abundant organism you see? The plants, the trees, and all the plants. Then after that, okay, the next most abundant might be the insects that eat those plants. And there's a lot of them. Then some mice that eat the insects, well, there's less of them. Snakes, there's even less. If you imagine any top carnivore you may be familiar with, a grizzly bear, an eagle, a shark, a lion. You know, you don't see in an ecosystem a flock of eagles, you know, flying from place to place. You don't see a big herd of grizzly bears running through the forest, or a school of hundreds of sharks swimming through the ocean. Those top carnivores are relatively rare, and it takes a wide area to support just one of them because of this energy pyramid. Because they're at the top of their food chain, and they're several levels up, there can't be very many of them.
Are they like so they're
Is this a food chain or food web? A web. So, what would you expect to find the least of in this ecosystem?
owl.
Yeah, the owl, or maybe the fox. And what would you find the most of? Yeah, the plants. Again, this is just another illustration showing the same thing.
I have questions. Mr. Duroff?
Yes, Chloe?
I had a question about that thing.
Yep.
Okay. Doesn't the owl eat the mice too?
Yeah, it could have multiple sources of food. All right, this, you don't have to do anything really. But the rabbit's a consumer, also called what? Heterotroph. Tree's a producer? Autotroph. And then the decomposer.